Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing a few book recommendations along with some tips and tricks for learning astrology. This is really just a condensed collection of a few of my favorites for beginners. Most of these have been featured on my channel at one point or another, but I'm hoping that including everything here is going to make it so that it can serve as a resource for anybody out there who wants to get into astrology. I also do not consider myself a professional astrologer or somebody who's quite advanced. I would say I'm more in the novice realm. I would say if I had to categorize myself, I am proficient and conversational in astrology. I can read a birth chart if you give me some time to sit with it, nothing too expedient. I am more of a tarot reader, but I do offer astrological add-ons to tarot readings, so I will factor in somebody's birth chart, but I'm not at the point where I feel I could give a full birth chart or natal chart reading to somebody. So take all of this with a grain of salt as somebody who is still in the beginning stages of their own journey. These are just a few books and things and resources that have worked for me thus far. Personally, I found astrology to be pretty intimidating. Coming into it, there's a lot to learn. There's a big technical side to it. I've found it a little bit more difficult, I would say, more time-consuming to learn than tarot, but I am enjoying my astrological studies. I would say before we even touch upon the books, one of my biggest tips for learning anything, especially astrology, is to just surround yourself with it as much as possible, whether that's through entertainment, various forms of media, seeking out different podcasts and videos and pop culture that references astrology. I think all of that is going to keep your mind in the right headspace to continue to retain the knowledge. Little tidbits will wind up in your periphery, and you'll suddenly feel like you're learning a lot more than you would if you were to just set aside allocated study time with a book. So that would be one big tip, and I do have a few recommendations for outside forms of media, which I'll get to, but first we're going to jump into the books. So the first one that I have to recommend for beginners, one that I have spoken to, I included this, I think, in I think it was reference books that I really enjoyed, and I stand by this. This is Astrology, A Cosmic Science by Isabel M. Hickey, the classic work on spiritual astrology, with a foreword by Stephen Arroyo. This I stand by as, in my opinion, the most comprehensive beginner book that I've read. It is a little bit technical and wordy, and it can get a bit dense and dry at some points, but it covers everything. It covers all of the zodiac and learning the signs. It covers the houses, aspects. I'm trying to think what else. Transits, just reading and interpreting a birth chart. It covers the whole gambit. Another preface I will say is that most of these books and tips and resources are going to be geared toward tropical astrology. I think some of them could go for Hellenistic, but if you're into other forms of astrology like Vedic and just various other forms, these tips are not going to be as helpful. Likewise, I would say that this is for reading natal charts. So if you're more into predictive or horary astrology, if you really want to get into synastry, these books are not going to give you too much on those sorts of things. I think they'll still be of use, but really they're for natal astrology, reading a birth chart. But this book really, to me, was the winner. I still reference it to this day. I think it has a little bit of everything. It is a little bit of a push to get through it just because it is a thicker one, and it reads somewhat like a textbook. There's a more spiritualized aspect, so that is where I would say it diverges from the technical. It is one that was written a few decades prior, so take what is said culturally speaking and also in terms of just modernity, all of that with a grain of salt. The lexicon's going to be a little bit different. Actually, a lot of these books are not super modern. They are written a few decades ago, and I found that in my experience, some of those older astrology books are actually where I learned the most. Some of the newer ones are a little bit too fluffy for me, and they don't actually get to the heart of anything. And yeah, so I really like when there's a lot of information condensed into one place. I would highly recommend this book if you can push yourself to get through it. I also think it would be great to just have on hand as a reference. So that's our first one. The next one that I have for beginners, I'm just going to go through three really standard all-around beginner books. The next one I have is Astrology for the Light Side of the Brain by Kim Rogers Gallagher. This one, it was a recommendation from Kasha from Tarot Map. I really enjoyed it. It's one that won't take too long, so this is one that you probably could read front to back in just a day or two if you really wanted to. It covers everything. It's a little bit more cheeky and fun, and it was written, I think, I'm trying to think. I think it was written in the 90s or the late 80s. So again, one of those ones where you have to take what's being said a little bit with a grain of salt. There are pop culture references, but of course those pop culture references aren't going to be super modern or relevant to now for anybody who is looking for that sort of thing. I'm not sure, but I still would really recommend it. I think it's pretty comprehensive. It's very relatable, which is part of the appeal, and it gets to the point. It's not a super long book. I think it's like, yeah, about 200 pages, not too bad. So definitely recommend this one. And then the third all-rounder beginner book that I would suggest, and this one is a modern one, and a modern one that kind of doesn't beat around the bush as much, which I appreciate, is The ABCs of Astrology, A Beginner's Guide to Becoming Your Own Astrologer by Arisha Mack. I mentioned this a month or two ago in a favorites video or a monthly recap video. I think this is great. This almost is today's version of Astrology for the Light Side of the Brain, because this referenced a lot of pop culture. This one does as well for the sake of example, but I think that this one does it a little bit better, and the examples, of course, are going to make more sense for today's climate. So there's that. There are examples of translating charts and going through that. Of course, it goes through all the signs, the houses, it goes through aspects. It really just does it all, and it's pretty concise as well. As you can see, it's another one that's shorter. So these second two that I just mentioned are going to be easier to get through. Yeah, again, this one is about the same, 200 pages. So yeah, and the font is not like terribly large. You'll get a lot of pages like this where there's not as much. So you can get through this one pretty quickly. Highly recommend. So those would be my 3 all-rounder beginner books that I would recommend to anybody. I've read a few other beginner books that were not the best, and that's why they're not featured in this video. But do feel free, if you have any recommendations of your own, to leave them down below so the comments can also be a resource. Now, just 2 random ones that I have to share. For example, I don't have too many more. I have had a lot of flops actually in terms of astrology books, which is why I wanted to make this video. I've picked up a few, started reading them, found them to not be well suited to me or the purposes that I was trying to use them for, or what I was looking to get out of them. So I was hoping that this video would be helpful for anybody out there who finds themselves in a similar position. This one's by Stephen Arroyo. It's Astrology, Psychology, and the 4 Elements, an Energy Approach to Astrology and its Use in the Counseling Arts. Personally, I think almost pretty much every book by Stephen Arroyo is a winner in my realm, but this was probably my favorite by him that I've read so far. I haven't read all of his work, but I have read a few books by him. This is what the cover looks like. It is, again, a thinner one, a smaller one, which is helpful, but I would say that this one's more dense than a beginner book. It does take into account that you have some understanding of the signs, the houses, and just astrology in general, so I would definitely say to read this maybe after a beginner book when you feel like you have at least somewhat of a grasp. But this is where I started to see astrology as more than just technical, where I started to see a more intuitive approach where elements and human dynamics and interpersonal relationships come in, where there is an art to the interpretation, not just a science. So this really switched up my headspace. It gave me a lot of perspective, and there are some really cool ways of interpreting and looking at astrology that are mentioned in here, specifically if you're looking to use your chart to assess yourself and going to look at other people's charts, helping them to assess themselves and get a better understanding using astrology in a more humanistic way, where we're trying to get a better understanding of why we're here, our purpose, those sorts of things. And there's a psychological element to this as well. Really enjoyed it. It kind of bridged spiritual, psychological, and technical all into one. You do have to pay attention. This is not one where you can just pick up, read a page or two, and put it down, and it's not that casual. You do have to invest your focus in this one, in my opinion. And then the last, I would say, just general book that I have. This one is a recent addition or a recent read for me, The 12 Houses, Exploring the Houses of the Horoscope by Howard Sasportas, foreword by Liz Green. Liz Green also has a lot of great work great books out there in writing on astrology, so I would recommend her as well. This is the cover. I think this one you'll see it probably a lot on Amazon. It gets recommended often. I Really enjoyed it. This is one that was also written a few decades prior. I want to say it was written in the 80s. So again, with those sort of pop culture references and the lexicon being used, and of course there are newer discoveries and ways of looking at things. However, I think this still holds up really well in terms of context and culture. I would say that this one's extremely comprehensive. In my opinion, houses, the idea of just knowing what the houses are, using them in interpretations and in birth charts, that is the part that is the most overlooked and underrated. In my opinion, it's something that I see, for example, in a lot of astrology videos, TikToks, all that. Houses are mentioned the least. I find them to be really important, and I think that this is a staple because we look at our signs, we look at aspects a lot, we look at all those sorts of things, but houses sort of get a secondary role, it feels like, sometimes in chart interpretation. This also goes through the signs, it goes through aspects, so I would say that in some ways this could be viewed as just an all-rounder beginner book, but it places obviously the most emphasis on the house system. And this one is based on Placidus' house system, although there's a section in the back that goes into various other types of house systems. So it's not like anything is left out or spoken down on. I actually really enjoyed the indexes, where I think it was an index where the various house systems are referenced so that one can make an informed decision about how they want to proceed. And for those who don't know, Placidus is a way of basically the formulation or the way that one would put house systems onto tropical astrology. And I would say that that's probably the most popular. If you have CoStar, if you use maybe Cafe Astrology to pull up your birth chart, they will likely use Placidus. I think you can modify it, or maybe not on CoStar, but you might be able to on Astrology Cafe. And there are other astrology websites where you can modify the house system you use. But this was really interesting. Houses are really important. Really love this. Would recommend 10 out of 10 along with the rest of the books that I just mentioned. So those would be basically my starter beginner books that I really enjoyed. I'm trying to think. And then I mentioned the authors. I think anything by Stephen Arroyo that I've read was really good. Liz Green and her writing is really great as well. Now, as far as other tips and tricks for learning astrology, like I said, surround yourself with it. Maybe seek out videos and podcasts. I know on TikTok there's a big astrological community at the moment. I think TikTok is another one of those platforms where you do have to take things with a grain of salt. It is kind of new. The audience tends to be younger and people are really excited to share things, but I'm not so keen on taking everything as holy writ that I see on TikTok in terms of astrology, although I do think it adds a fun and light element a lot of the time where you can feel engaged, where you feel like you're learning through more of an entertaining way of going about it, where memes are used and just little fun games are played with astrology, or roasting the signs, or hot takes on moon signs from a certain thing, or when you have, a conjunction of this and that, people will get really creative and fun with it. So TikTok is actually one I would recommend, but I would say to use your critical thinking when listening and absorbing any of that information. Another form or platform, I think obviously YouTube is great. I'm here on YouTube. I watch a lot of different channels that mention astrology. I love Samantha Menzo's channel where she speaks about astrology. I know that she offers birth chart readings and she's a really great astrologer, and she has the Speaking of Which podcast with Skylar, so that's one I would definitely recommend. I also would recommend I think it's the Astrology podcast with, oh my gosh, what is his name? Something Brennan. You'll definitely know who I'm talking about, and I'll link it down below or I'll put it on the screen, but it's called the Astrology Podcast on YouTube. You can listen to it as a podcast, or you can see the visual. There's the main guy who runs it, whose name I'm blanking on, something Brennan, and he usually has other people on. They'll speak about different types of astrology, different topics. It gets a little bit more technical, so you do have to engage yourself in it. You have to think and remain focused, and sometimes there are longer podcasts that are well over an hour or a few hours. But that is one I would recommend. They speak a lot about different topics on astrology, so that's another way to keep yourself thinking and feeling like you're surrounded by it. It does get a bit more heady and technical, so maybe having a few beginner books where you can know the terms a little bit before diving in, because I think they don't really take into account that somebody might not know anything about astrology coming into the podcast. So that's another thing. Another way or tip I would have for learning astrology, of course, is to pull up your birth chart, maybe download some apps Ones that I have on my phone are CoStar. I think just CoStar and Pattern, which I would both recommend. I know CoStar has come under some fire, and I think it was because there were allegations about them giving strange horoscopes to people. Nonetheless, the actual data that you get when you put in your information is accurate, and I like the fact that you can be friends with somebody on there. You can befriend your friends in real life or your contacts if they also have an account on CoStar, and you can compare birth charts. You can put them side by side, so there's a little bit of synastry, and not actually, I don't think you can like overlap the actual birth charts, but you can compare the two. It's really user friendly, especially for beginners, and of course it's going to keep you engaged if you can then interact with others, and it even tells you on like a day-to-day basis who might be good to seek out in your life and why, which people you might want to avoid given certain transits and things like that. So I find that really helpful and fun. So that's one that keeps me engaged. Pattern is another one where you can add friends and see if you have similarities in terms of your charts, but also transits and where the planets are at and what's going on. And then you'll get these really in-depth horoscopes that are pretty detailed that switch up depending on the transits. So those are two I would recommend. Of course, pulling up your birth chart. Something like Cafe Astrology is going to be great because they give you some element of interpretation, but I would say that it is a little bit more dry and just, to the point and very cookie cutter, but I think it's still helpful nonetheless. Investigating all of those other websites to see what works for you and how you can pull up your chart and learn from it, and just having it in front of you to be able to take notes on as you're reading these books, so that way you can say, oh, well, I have this in my chart and I'm reading about that now, or having maybe a friend's chart there to be able to look at for comparison's sake. All of those are things I think that are really helpful. I know that I speak a lot about cards and there's a lot of tarot on this channel, and if you're watching this, you're probably interested in those things as well. I would say having an astrology deck of some sort might be really helpful for study and just to keep yourself engaged in a more active way. Two that I recommend and that I've shown on this channel before. The first one really is the Holistic Astrological Cards for Guidance, Forecasting, and Healing by Carney Zor. I've shown this a bunch of times. I know Kasha from Tarot Map has a bunch of, I think she has an interview with Carney Zor. I know that they have done, Zoom lectures on astrology as well. They're both great astrologers, both Kasha from Tarot Map and Carney Zor, so I would recommend checking both of them out. But this deck is wonderful. It is sort of a mix of Eastern and Western astrology, so you get a little bit of everything. I like that there's more art on it and it's not super dry, so you're going to be engaged visually speaking. You have the houses, the planets, the signs. What else do you get in here? We get the midheaven, so you get that's another just point in the chart. You don't get aspects, but that's pretty much the only thing you don't get. But there is Eastern and Western astrology. It's pretty comprehensive. And I do have the book, which I'm going to show in just a second. And I would also definitely recommend picking up the book with this deck. I think that this is something that enhances it greatly, especially if you're a beginner astrologer and you're looking to learn. You get more information on any of the signs, houses, planets, and it gets just put into context for you. And of course, this is like more, I would say, user-friendly and visual, so you don't have to worry about it being dense and dry and textbook-like. The other deck that I would recommend, the other astrological deck that I would recommend is the Living Wheel astrology cards, which I know many have seen. And the backs look like this. It's a smaller deck. And this one, visually speaking, is not my favorite, but I think it's great if you want to lay them out, potentially to see where certain planets are, if you're trying to visually even put the transit, say, on a table, or map out your own birth chart and trying to make it a bigger thing where cards are doing that and there's a visual aspect. I think this is great to do on a table. So you get the planets, you get the houses, you get pretty much everything like that. I don't think you get the moon phases, you get, as you'll see here, I don't think you get aspects, and then there are seasonal cards. I think there's 8 of them, so the wheel of the year is broken up into 8 seasons. These cards are actually really pretty, probably the prettiest ones in the deck visually speaking. You see, yeah, they're really nice. So those are the two that I would recommend the most and the ones that I use the most. I tend to use the holistic astrology cards if I'm doing an astrological add-on for somebody in a card reading. Then I might, for example, pull a card from there to see what part of their natal chart we should look at for answers about whatever they may be inquiring, or to just have a little bit of a look. I think my final tip again would be to surround yourself with it, to make it a daily practice. I think it's easy to get intimidated and overrun by the amount of information that's out there on astrology and what you feel like you must know in order to be proficient or to interpret. There's a lot to it, a lot of technicality. I think taking it one step at a time, day by day, and just maybe reading a little bit of a book each day, or looking at your birth chart each day, or pulling up the transits. Definitely maybe having an ephemeris on hand, although that's not as necessary, I would say, in modern times, because you can find basically an ephemeris and know all the transits online by looking them up. But having one to have to actually go and look and see what the date is and what's where and what's moving into what is going to be helpful, I think, for more of, I would say, retaining the knowledge. So having an ephemeris would be really great as well. I'd recommend that. One thing that I did just recently acquire that I like as a study tool, but also just as a fun, useful item, is this planner. I forget the name of like what the planner is, but it is customized to me. So it has my birth chart in it. You can see my name's on the bottom. It has my sun, moon, and rising here, and it starts from July. It goes from July of 2021 to June of 2022. So it's a year-long planner. I'll link the website where I got this down below. It's from a website called Honeycomb, and I saw it on TikTok. Somebody mentioned it on TikTok. You can even pick the type of art you want in it. They give you a few options. This has transits. It has your chart. It even has a key to tell you what the various symbols are, like what planets, moon phases, aspects, all that sort of thing, the signs, what those little shorthand symbols are, and how to read them. You get, for example, you can see the transits for a month, and then you get each month, you get to see all the transits, and then per day you get to see, there's obviously the moon cycles, but you'll get all the transits, and then it's color coded so you know if the transit is creating an aspect in your natal chart, or if it's just generally speaking, two planets, creating some sort of aspect. So that's really helpful. There's room for notes and to write things down, so it can be used like a normal planner. That's from the day to day, and you'll see the transits, the moon cycles, and then say, for example, that's 1 week, and then on the other side you get notes so that you can write a lot more if you want to, which I think is helpful. You can customize this quite a bit. I chose to have an online and a hard copy. I got it in spiral bound. I was able to pick the art in it. I was able to pick the house system I want. I was able to pick if I wanted, for example, my Chiron included or asteroids included. So there's a lot of customization. I picked whole house for this one instead of Placidus. I've been resonating a lot more with my chart looking at it through the whole house system. So that's just been where I'm at investigating, but being curious, finding little things like this that kind of get you excited about astrology, I think are important. It's easy to fall off the wagon when it feels boring and droll and intimidating and like there's just so much to it. But when you take it one step at a time and just try to implement little flourishes and sprinkles of astrology throughout your day, I think you wind up over the course of a few weeks and months learning quite a bit, even though it might not feel like it. So I would say that's pretty much all I have to share at this current juncture. I'll be sure to maybe do a bit of a follow-up as my astrological journey progresses and I find myself in new spaces with new books and recommendations to offer. But I hope everybody enjoyed this. I hope you're all well. Like and subscribe if this was fun and interesting. And until next time, bye.